So, what was the cause of World War One? Then we typed that into Canvas chat. There's quite a few answers that could go in there. Don't forget to complete the chapter readings. Chapter 18, and the pages assigned, and 19 are there for you already. But today, let's look at the notes, starting with the beginnings of war. All right. So, World War One will be a huge turning point in European and world history for a variety of reasons. But some of the biggest ones include, bless you, the turmoil that will continue on into World War II, basically. So it won't be settled. So it completely disrupts the balance. We saw it in the beginning with the Crimean War, but this definitely upsets the balance of power in Europe and the traditional way the states are set up and relate to each other. It will also be one of the last, this in World War II, one of the last huge traumatizing events for the populace of Europe. It will intertwine industrialization with the war making effort on a large scale for the first time. And it obviously, as I just mentioned, it will be a precursor to World War II. The issues here are not settled. In fact, some of the ending clauses in the Versailles Treaty end up causing World War II to begin with. So, at the beginning of this, of course, is the alliance system. The German Empire is new on the scene in the 1870s. It had a large population, lots of wealth, lots of industrialization. So it matched France, but of course it weakened France in order to establish itself. So it really was the leading power on the mainland continent of Europe. Nationalism was continually weakening. In the meantime, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria could not manage to match Germany's power because of the internal struggles that they faced. So Bismarck ended up setting up an emperor's league with Austria and Russia because he didn't like the idea of Austria's territory becoming destabilizing. And he figured the massive territorial and population influence of these three people could have some common ground. But that didn't last long. And Russia would eventually depart in particular. In fact, they couldn't really decide what to do with the rest of Eastern Europe, even as a Congress of Berlin tried to address the question in 1878. And Bismarck's time was kind of biting because he was continuing to operate things behind the scene, but eventually, of course, he is going to butt heads with a young new Kaiser, William II, and eventually Bismarck is going to be dismissed in his later years as the leader of the political system. But Germany and Austria eventually signed on a mutual treaty, which will eventually be joined by Italy. France, on the other hand, was concerned about the growing influence of Germany, and so it decided to form an alliance with the rebuffed Russia that was rejected by the others. And so France and Russia are going to end up allying themselves together. Germany will try to build a navy, which is going to, of course, irritate Britain to some extent, and eventually that's going to push Britain toward France. This is especially true when Germany attempts to have more influence over Africa. Remember, they didn't have that much. Bismarck wasn't really interested in having colonies, but once he's out of the way, Germany then picks up interest again and tries to get some more territory. France and Britain further their alliance in order to stop them from doing that. And so we eventually have what is known as the Triple Entente, and Entente is spelled Entente, and that will be Britain, Russia, and France. And then we have the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Italy will change sides during the war. So they're not exactly the most dependable out of all these countries. And we'll start to see moves toward the war long before Ferdinand is assassinated. Austria will take over Bosnia. This, of course, would be kind of a irritating move because Russia, as you know, being Orthodox Christian, wanted to protect the Orthodox Christian people of the Balkans, and didn't like this interference by Austria. Eventually, after some flare-ups and violence in what are known as the two Balkan Wars, it is clear that Austria wants to have further control over the territory, including Serbia and possibly Albania. So we can see the territory used to be under control of the Ottoman Empire. And then by 1913, we can see the different parts attempting to gain their independence and self-identity, such as Montenegro and Albania in particular. But then, of course, that is going to be under the influence later of the Central Powers. And the Ottoman Empire is going to try once again to take over the territory. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the Austrian throne. He takes the position seriously. He's traveling, of course, to visit the people of the Balkans. He wears fancy hats. And so he is en route to becoming the new leader. The current leader of Austria doesn't really think too much of him. And so he doesn't have a problem with him going off to this dangerous area where lots of people hate the Austrians. The assassination is carried out by the Black Hand, a nationalist, some would say terrorist organization intent on freeing Serbia from Austrian influence. And actually, the assassination attempt almost failed with a loss of nerve and some mistakes that were made. The lead assassin, of course, ends up storming off, and he ends up actually walking down a street, and I believe the route of the car actually changed. And so, what a coincidence, there he is again. Now I get to shoot him. And for some odd reason, his wife. So this, of course, sets off a flurry of activity. Austria was determined to invade. Germany pledged to support them. And Russia, in the meantime, wanting to protect the Orthodox Christian territories, wanted to defend Serbia, which was going to eventually draw in France and then later on Britain. So Austria decided to mobilize, ask their armies to gather all their troops and poise for an invasion. Russia would do the same. Germany declared war on Russia, which is the odd thing because Austria is supposedly the leader in this effort, but Germany is the one that declares war. And the next day, they also declare war on France, Russia's ally. Making it even more confusing, of course, Germany first invades Belgium on their way to France, not to direct efforts necessarily toward Russia. Now, Britain has an alliance with Russia and France, but not to the extent that they're going to directly defend them, at least not right away. But they do have treaties with Belgium, and Belgium is invaded, so Britain is drawn in as well. Germany is able to invade France pretty easily from the northeast through Belgium. And when this happens, of course, Britain doesn't really have a choice. They definitely need to put troops into the mainland continent. And there's a picture of the lovely couple. They both have fancy hats on. Nationalism played a role in the cause of the war because, and this isn't unusual, this happened at the beginning of the American Civil War, nationalism, of course, pumped a lot of people up. They thought, this is our chance to prove our country superior, that we have the toughest military, that we have the best system. And so lots of people were actually eager for the war to begin, leadership and maybe even to some extent some civilians. But right away, even though the Germans had invaded France, they didn't get too far before they got bogged down in territory, but also French resistance. And something that happened almost immediately is they then had to dig in what will be later referred to as trench warfare. And this will make up kind of the overall, the overall image of the war. Long, drawn-out conflict with men rotting away in trenches, with a no man's land in between that no one dare cross. But it also, of course, increased the efforts to move beyond the trenches. So the British, for instance, would introduce the tank in 1916. Because at the edges of all the trenches, there were machine guns being used. And there was also rough territory, so why not use a tank to go through? However, they were incredibly clumsy, they overheated quite easily, and they got terrible mileage. In the East, this, of course, continued as well, with trench warfare and misery existing between the Germans and the Russians. Most of the technological advent, of course, was being used on the Western Front, but both sides ended up for a long time in stalemate. There are some big battles that do have some results, but for the most part, the lines are going to stay in place for a considerable period of time. The Germans go back to their naval ability, and so they introduced submarine warfare, especially around Britain, to try to sink supplies and cut the British government and its people off from their military in Europe. This would lead to some problems, particularly because the British were also purchasing arms from America, and there were still passengers going back and forth between the two places. So the Lusitania which was carrying a large amount of British and American passengers, ends up being sunk by a German sub. The Germans say it's because Lusitania was carrying armaments, which they were actually. It was later discovered, long after the war. But needless to say, the large amount of civilians being killed would lead the United States to declaring war on Germany in 1917. Out of the countries involved, the one with the largest population would be Russia, followed by the United States, then Germany. Despite this, the amount of soldiers available was greater in Germany out of all the countries, over 2.2 million. Next would be France with 1.25 because they had been preparing and mobilizing for a considerable period of time. Russia spent the most money on the war, followed by Germany. And despite the German naval attempts, Britain would far outspend and outperform when it comes to Navy action. In fact, I just mentioned submarines, but actually France and Britain both had more submarines than Germany. Up on the screen, you can see the Schlieffen Plan to invade from the northeast, swinging around the enemy in the northeast corner of France. And the alliance system here, put out in colors. The greenish area is the Triple Entente, Britain, Russia, and France. Eventually, they would gain allies in the peach color, which if you'll notice, includes Italy, as Italy will not stay on the side of Germany and Austria. Germany and Austria become known as the Central Powers, and they eventually take on the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, who hopes this will be one last chance for greatness, but it turns out it will be one last nail in their coffin. On the Western Front, you can see the territory where things get bogged down. The farthest German advance is in purple, and so they don't really make it too far into the country. There's attempts to push out, but you'll see the biggest rout will happen when the Americans get involved by the red arrows here on the right-hand side. But that will take a long time, and it will take the continued advancement of technology, including tanks and tank-like equipment, in order to get through the tough territory and the no man's land in between the trenches. Tomorrow we'll talk about some of the issues of the war. Then we'll talk about the troubles of peace, and then the aftermath in between the two wars. So for the remainder of the period, make sure you complete the reading. Don't forget chapter 18 and 19.